Hey folks, and welcome back to the channel. Now in this video we'll be taking a look at a game called Beyond Contact, which is a sci-fi survival game focused on exploring and surviving a foreign planet with a healthy dose of challenges for you to overcome along the way. Now before I get started, I do just want to mention that this video is sponsored by PlayOn, so a huge thank you to them, and worry not, I made sure specifically to ask PlayCorp, the developers of Beyond Contact, if they were comfortable with me giving my open and honest thoughts about the game and my criticisms, which they're absolutely happy with. So in this video I'll be talking about the game's premise, my experience with the game in about 10 hours or so of gameplay, what I liked, what I didn't like, and where I think there might be some room for improvement. If you enjoy this video and like your survival games, drop a like and subscribe to the channel for more videos just like this one. Light spoilers ahead, so use your own discretion. So first things first, what is Beyond Contact? The game is predominantly focused around the planet of Catern, which you crash land on during the opening cinematic. The planet is undergoing a significant crisis in which the planet is effectively breaking apart, which is where you come in. As a member of Space Corps, you and any friends, should you choose to play co-op, are sent to investigate and help evacuate any intelligent life on the planet. Unfortunately for you, you end up trapped there with them, and thus the survival aspect of the game begins. There's two modes of play with Beyond Contact, one being the story mode that I've just mentioned, and the conquest mode, which is a more open-ended sandbox focused on building defenses and clearing the planet of corruption. This mode is new to the game as I understand it, being added in the 1.0 version that was recently released. When you first kick off the story in Beyond Contact, you'll have a choice of 3 characters, but only one of those is available for your first playthrough. The others are purchasable with credits, which at first I thought might be microtransactions, but upon closer inspection, these credits are essentially earned in-game through daily tasks that you can complete. From the gameplay that I've experienced with Beyond Contact, this is actually one of the things I considered to be its strongest features. The fact that there's pretty much always something to be doing. The game has a whole host of objectives for you to be chasing, whether it's towards your ultimate goal of figuring out what happened to Catern or getting off the planet, researching new recipes, or completing side quests and daily tasks. There's always something to aim for, and I'm a big fan of that in survival games, rather than approaching from the angle of a sandbox where you have to, and I say this in air quotes, make your own story. Beyond Contact gives you clear and manageable goals to aim for. The tutorial was completely optional and can be skipped entirely if you'd like, but it does introduce you to some of the core mechanics of the game, such as scanning items for research data. This becomes a pretty integral part of the game as you progress, documenting unknown items to better develop your defensive capabilities, survival efforts, and base building opportunities. One thing I will say about the tutorial though is that it didn't really teach me the keybinds associated to a lot of the actions it was talking about, so I can recommend going in and looking through the keybinds before beginning the game properly, as this will be a huge help further into the game itself. Now, I did want to mention this particular part fairly early on in the video because it's one of the very first things you're greeted with upon starting the game, and is simultaneously one of my biggest criticisms for Beyond Contact, and that's the voice acting. While some characters in both the cinematics and in-game were convincing, others not so much.
Everyone's gone? Just like that?
I found some of the voice acting to be a bit lacking, and I think it would be very easy for that to put new players off in the early stages, especially with the game being quite focused around a narrative and being story driven, at least on your first playthrough of the game. The artwork for the cutscenes and dialogues though, absolutely spot on. Whoever drew the character art, for example, is incredibly talented, I have to say, and this does somewhat help you to look past the voice acting in some cases. Now the story elements of the game are actually pretty good from what I've experienced so far. Crash landing on a foreign planet doesn't exactly sound like a new premise for sci-fi games by any means, but the twists and turns along the way definitely kept me engaged, and I did genuinely want to find out what happened next. Obviously I want to avoid going into detail here to avoid spoilers, but suffice to say the story itself was engaging and helped sell the setting and the mood of being trapped on a collapsing hostile planet. This brings me nicely onto Beyond Contact's world and map design, which honestly I think is the game's biggest strength. The planet of Ctern is beautiful, there's just no doubt about that. Within a couple of hours playing, I'd seen at least 4 biomes. By 10 hours that had significantly increased. There's grassy plains, dense jungles, murky swamps, and even magma fields, to name just a few of the areas that I encountered. The biomes were incredibly distinctive in their design, and the various fauna and flora that you find certainly help to immerse you in your surroundings. Each biome had new resources to find, new enemy types to worry about, and plenty of other environmental hazards too. All of this, coupled with the strong narrative, yet again reinforced the exploration aspect of the game. It's immersive and genuinely makes you feel like you're exploring something that hasn't yet been documented. Now, as for the combat in Beyond Contact, I think it's best described as simple at best. Ultimately, if you're looking at getting Beyond Contact, it probably shouldn't be for the combat, as it's predominantly a simple loop of left click, dodge, left click, with a mix of gadgets like turrets to assist you and defend your existing structures. Even with some of the more advanced weaponry that you'll find along the way and enemies that you come up against later in the game, the basic loop of combat still remains. It's not bad by any means, but it's also not very intricate either. The game's strengths are definitely the exploration and storytelling aspects, not so much the combat, despite the variety of enemies that you'll find on your journey. Now, researching and gradual progression in Beyond Contact is similar to what you'd expect from most survival games of its nature, but that doesn't mean it's bad. In fact, it takes an existing system that many players will be comfortable with from other games and expands upon it slightly. Now, as I mentioned earlier, each biome has new materials and life forms that you can scan for data, right? You then sync this data you've gathered into researching new recipes. Everyday actions like mining for resources, gathering from plants, or killing creatures also provides a small amount of this data to be used for further research. Learning these recipes takes time, as your augmented reality assistant, known as Carl, puts the data to good use over a predetermined period whilst you go about your business elsewhere. He'll also remind you every so often, if you haven't researched anything in a while, that he can be doing this for you. You can decide if you want to focus on the base building aspects of research first, as an example, or spread your research across multiple areas to try and keep things on the same page. Certain aspects of the research trees require progression in the main story, or items from biomes you'll encounter later down the line, so it's relatively well staggered and isn't overwhelming as a system. It's effective, familiar, and both easy to use and follow. Now, one of my few criticisms for Beyond Contact that I feel might not appeal to everyone is the way that it handles inventory and backpack space. At the bottom of your screen you'll find your hotbar, which is a pretty familiar concept to most people that have played some survival games, I'm sure. But what I'm not particularly a fan of is that there's no other inventory screen. Sure, you can build a backpack, but all that really does is add some additional spots to said hotbar, which soon creates a cluttered screen space that I feel like could be majorly tidied up just by having 4 or 5 options on that hotbar and the rest being moved to an inventory screen, especially for a game that has such an emphasis on your surroundings and the frankly gorgeous world design elements. I would have thought that less UI that's active on the screen at once is better. Thankfully, at the very least, you'll be able to build storage chests at your base of operations where you can store some supplies for later if you want to make sure that you've got plenty of space on your person whilst you're out and about. Right, so the last point that I wanted to make sure I covered in this video was the base building aspects of Beyond Contact. Now, where this element really shines is in the conquest mode, where you'll have to defend your base from waves of attackers. The story mode, at least as far as I've gotten so far, there seems to be much less of a requirement to build defensively, and it's more about facilitating your exploration with useful gadgets and storage. The perspective of the game, I'm referring to the camera angle here by the way, actually somewhat aids the building system in that it's relatively simple to understand and implement. There's no issues with finicky placement of objects, and everything snaps together perfectly, being clearly displayed to the player before they do so. In some first or third person games, you have that free placement aspect, which can often cause more problems than it's worth. So whilst it might limit your creativity somewhat, in Beyond Contact the system works for the camera perspective in use and allows the player to build some pretty expansive space exploration exploration sites. Now, before I wrap this one up, my closing thoughts on Beyond Contact are essentially that it's a great choice for a cost-effective exploration and survival game. While the combat is not very weighted, if it's an immersive and story-driven game you're after, then I can wholeheartedly recommend it as a solid pickup for an affordable price point. Beyond Contact does have some points for improvement in my mind, but for the most part, it's secondary features that don't impact on the progressional aspects of the game or the overarching narrative, which I found myself wanting to push further the deeper I got into the game itself. So that's just about it for me in this one. I'd be really interested to get some thoughts from the community on the game as well, so if it's something you'd be wanting to give a try, or if you've bought it already and have some thoughts about the game, please do feel free to drop them down in the comments below. Any questions, please feel free to ask, and I'll do my very best to answer them all. Special thank you to all of my wonderful patrons for their support for the channel, for joining me on our whitelisted game servers, and if you fancy joining them, there is a link in the description to the Patreon. Thanks folks, and I will see you all in the next one.